Senator Scullion.
Mr President, I rise today to make a contribution to a very important piece of legislation. It's a private member's bill, the Environmental Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Amendment Making Marine Parks Accountable Bill of 2012. I note that the allocation of speaking times, I've got 20 minutes, and so this is actually being run as a pretty conventional debate that no doubt is in some way would normally conceive as adversarial. I'm a bit surprised. I actually thought this would be in the section of non-contro. It's a very sensible piece of legislation with some principal elements of the legislation that I would have thought just would have been simply ticked off by all sides, and we could have just moved on by having a very sensible series of amendments to a piece of legislation that at the moment is causing a great deal of concern right across the Australian communities, particularly on those people who are concerned about the environment, those people who are concerned about their livelihoods and their jobs, particularly around coastal communities, and also for those people in the scientific community who want to continue to maintain that Australia has not only the best fisheries management regimes in the world, but in terms of our marine estate, we are managing it with the very best legislation. So I'm not expecting anything but support for this legislation, and perhaps I'm a little optimistic, but I've never read a piece of legislation under whose principles are just so simply and effectively put, Mr. President, and Madam Acting Deputy President, that it beggars belief that we'll be even having too robust a debate. But it's an opportunity for me to stand and explain the benefits, which I'm sure you'll all be agreeing on. The member for Dawson has introduced this legislation, no doubt as a consequence of his experience. He's lived in a marine community. He knows when we had poor planning, the consequences of poor planning. The poor planning legislation, well, I can just take that. We're going to have already, we've got interjections to the other side, and someone asked me, well, who put those things in place? Well, I'm going to get to exactly who actually decided that marine protected areas should be currency in a political debate, and so the outcomes and the motivation from providing for a marine protected area should be about a deal with the Greens and political preferences rather than looking after the environment. But I would hope that those opposite would just simply understand that we have gone well beyond those issues now. We're now moving to a far more rational way to manage our oceans. So in this country, Madam Acting Deputy President, it's quite clear that there is no reason that we should have a poor planning outcome. There is not a single reason, because we are endowed with the very best internationally. We're endowed with the best science. We are the envy of the world in terms of our marine scientists and the stuff that they do. We've got, whether it's CSIRO, Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, Australian Institute of Marine Research, the Australian Fisheries Management Authority, all of our fisheries officers around Australia and the states and territories, all who do an absolutely outstanding job. Not only outstanding because we stand in this place and we don't like to annoy people too much, so we all call them outstanding, but I can recall in another life as the chairman of the International Coalition of Fisheries, and we were the envy. Australia were the envy of the world, and the connection clearly between the fact that we had such great scientific resources was tied so closely to how we had the best managed fisheries and marine ecosystems internationally. So there's no reason at all that we should have a poor planning decision, except the challenge is it's not only about owning these wonderful individuals, these wonderful institutions and the advice that they provide. It's actually using them and taking consideration of the advice and ensuring that we do so. Now, we know, particularly in the issue about marine protected areas and marine planning, those institutions have been completely ignored or sidelined on many occasions. And every time that has happened, there has been a negative impact not only on the environment, but those people who wish to use the environment sustainably and the communities that they support. We also have a great wealth in another area. We've got a great wealth in an area of science that's not particularly well known publicly, but we have modellers who can actually model the impact on pretty much anything. It was towards the very later years in the rollout, probably around 2005, 2006, that this science really came to the notice of the Australian community. But that science is, of course, measuring the impact on communities of almost any change. So, for example, you can say, well, if we decided that we would take the tourism out of here, we'll push the rainforest down, we'll put sugarcane in, someone will be able to tell you the exact impacts on the businesses and the communities that rely on them at that stage. So these are change modellers. And a friend of mine, Melanie Fisher, I don't know what Melanie's doing at the moment, but she gave us some fantastic advice about the direct impacts on communities. And so we can actually, when we model the impact on a community of a particular decision, we can moderate that decision and change that decision to ensure that it minimises any impact on the community. And it can be as much as, in terms of marine protected areas, actually changing a zone, moving a zone slightly over, changing a use pattern in regard to the actual distance from a port. That might actually keep two fuel businesses in business. So we have the science, not only in looking after our ecosystem and this wonderful marine biosphere, but also how to look after the communities that depend on it. But again, we actually have to ensure that the decision makers, and in terms of Commonwealth marine protected areas, the decision makers are in this place, well, not entirely, and I'll get that to that in a moment, but those decision makers need to ensure that we rely on information that's been provided by that great science, both in the conventional sense and in the marine sense. So we have had a bit of a sad history, and I touched on it earlier with the interjection, but in terms of the rollout of marine protected areas, it's a bit of a sad one. Now, motive has played a big part in my life. I'm not sure where I sort of stumble on the term, but I'd also like to think, well, what's motivating this person to approach me? What's motivating me to go through this activity? And I think that's a very important part of life. And when you look at the motivation for a marine protected area, I think its success will lie pretty much on the motivation. Now, if you're motivated to protect a particular piece of iconic biodiversity, it's very likely that particular piece of iconic biodiversity will be protected. But if you're motivated, as we have seen in plenty of times, certainly in this place, and at a state level, certainly New South Wales is a standout, where they were simply motivated by making a currency out of marine protected areas so that you could do a preference deal with the Greens. This isn't some sort of assertion. This is something that's been well documented, particularly in Queensland, that a deal was done. We will roll out this. We will give you these protected areas to the Greens if you give us your preferences in these seats. So the motivation of the Labor government in Queensland and the Labor government then in New South Wales was simply to say, I want to get myself re-elected. Well, the motivation of getting myself re-elected is hardly a way to manage fisheries. It's hardly a way to manage our biosphere. And that's why it's failed. That's why it's fundamentally failed. Now, of course, the capacity to be able to do that, the capacity to be able to politically interfere with good science, we as Australians should embrace every single opportunity to take away the perverse capacity to do that. And I'm not saying those on this side, and putting my hand on my heart, that we wouldn't do such a thing. I think when such a thing exists in politics, it provides a temptation that may be available to anyone. So we should remove it. And that's exactly what this piece of legislation does. This piece of legislation will ensure that we use the very best science. It ensures that his time is set aside to ensure that there's no perverse and unintended consequences, which is something in this place we are always trying to avoid. And so, now I know that we're having complaints from Labor. Now, they don't want this tool taken away from them. It's a tool that they use time and time again in their relationship with the Greens, We haven't had to use the tool because we don't have a similar relationship with the Greens, so they don't come and talk to us about what we're going to lock up if we give them their preferences. So when this legislation passes, those sort of circumstances will be a thing of the past. And that's why I think this really should have broad support from this place. I know it will certainly have broad support in the wider community. Now, it is really important part of this legislation is the element of the legislation that ensures that the term before. So before you proclaim an area, these are the things that need to be done. So instead of saying, right, we're going to go out and we're going to close all these areas and then we're going to deal with the impacts, the negative impacts, everybody accepts, whether it's a displaced effort, whether it's smashing communities you didn't really mean to, whether you didn't really budget for it, so ensuring that the commercial effort you can offset, you didn't have a budget for it, oh sorry about that, we just can't do it for you now. That won't happen again. That won't happen again. And so fundamentally this legislation I think is encapsulated in the amendment at the end of section 343. And it says at the end of that section, it says, the minister must obtain and the director must report on scientific advice. Now, I know you'll be recoiling on the other side for a suggestion that this place must take on board scientific advice, but I think it's something that the wider Australian community would agree with. Then it goes on to say stakeholders' views. Now again, I'm not really sure what the problem's going to be from the other side on this, but I would have thought that stakeholders' views would be really important to consider in this matter. It is a very, very important matter. This is a matter about communities, it's a matter about jobs, this is a matter about sustainability. Very important issues that need to be discussed with the stakeholders. And it goes on to say, and an independent social and economic impact assessment. So the Melanie Fishers of the world who've done such brilliant work for the first time will be consulted. Before you make the proclamation, before you make the proclamation, so instead of making the proclamation and then having to go and try to tidy up the mess afterwards, Senator McLucas, places like Cairns, instead of smashing those communities and smashing those businesses in Cairns, what will happen if there's amendments made? There will be some research done. A social assessment and economic assessment will be done to ensure that we can have a balance of both things. And of course, best science. Australia has, as I've said, an enormous amount of experts, and it's all about ensuring that we use them in this place. And that's exactly what this legislation does. But the most important element is the last line. It says, goes on to say, an independent social and economic impact assessment before proclamations over areas of sea over both land and sea are made. And of course, one of what we know, we learn as time goes on. One of the things that we know about rolling out a marine protected area, 30 years ago we thought it was a great thing, oh, it's one of those things, solitaire islands, we'll sneak one around here, that'll be fine. But what we knew pretty soon was everybody said, oh look, there's an awful lot more fishermen in the area over here adjacent to that. Well, why is that? Well, we're not allowed here anymore. So we've learnt that we've taken a whole bunch of fishermen from one area and pushed them into other areas, so we've actually increased fishing pressure in other areas. Now we know that all the science in the world says you cannot displace effort. You cannot displace effort. And so on the very first day of the proclamation, the very first day, people can't go to an area, so they go to an adjacent area. So from that first day, day two of something to protect the environment, you've increased pressure. You've increased pressure. That's always been the challenge. And what this piece of legislation from the member of Dawson does is actually ensure that the effort has been displaced before a proclamation. So there is no net negative impact on the environment. None. For the first time, we've learnt from the past, and now there will be no displaced effort. And of course, I've been in this place from time to time, and I've talked about what we can actually manage. Now, there's plenty of issues around marine protected areas, and when you say marine protected areas, a lot of people think, oh, you know, fish and whales and all those sort of things. But when you put a marine protected area in, you're actually having more of an impact, because a marine protected area actually only affects people. Because I can assure you there'll be no dugongs out there inspecting the Amendment 343 of the Environmental Protection, Biodiversity, Conservation Amendment making marine parks accountable bill. None of them will be doing that. There'll be no mackerel, there'll be no dugong saying, oh, I'm not going to go there then. That's going to be completely different. It's only going to affect people. We can only impact by legislation on people, and on people it will impact. It will impact on coastal communities. And if you want to be fair income, you'll accept this legislation, because this legislation ensures that we consult science and we get it right first. We get it right first. And we don't make any action until such time as we have got it right. And it's not a matter of slowing these things down, it's all part of a planning process. Yes, the planning process might have an 18-month lead-up time. We may say we intend to close this area and declare these, and they will be declared when we've gone through these processes and finished these processes. This is best science. This is what the scientists will tell you. This is what the social assessors and the social scientists and experts will tell you. These things have to be planned and have to be done in this particular manner. And that's exactly what this legislation says. This legislation says that this is the process, this is what you're going to do. Now, there's another actual element of this that of the legislation that says, look, at the end of the day, when they've done it all, let's check to see they've got it right. Let's check to see they've got it right. So actually it'll have to be a disallowable instrument, sit on the Parliament, so we're going to have a chat about it, and those on the other side are shaking their heads because they don't want it to be. We don't mind. We don't mind transparency. We don't mind the representatives of the people at the highest possible level in this land having a look at that and saying, well, I'm not sure whether you've actually displaced all the effort, whether you've compensated the impact so you don't actually, you know, sort of approach it with, oh, look, it doesn't matter if all these communities are smashed and those businesses shut down, when, you know, they'll build up, or we'll compensate you later. That's not going to work. And of course, there's been some terrific arguments on the other side. You know, I can remember Mark Furner, Senator Furner, lovely bloke, but in the last debate here, he was rolled out and said, go and argue the impossible. Poor old Furner stood up and said, listen, if we have a disallowable instrument, it's going to cause coral bleaching. Coral bleaching, that's what's going to happen if we have more transparency. Yeah, that's, I know, this is the Hansard here, Senator McDonald. It was a sad day, great bloke, but, you know, it's very difficult to defend the indefensible. So, the circumstance, the other issue is, of course, it's going to give us something that's a complete change. It's going to give us the capacity to actually budget for it. And we know the disaster in Queensland, Yeah, indeed, because we didn't plan it properly. We didn't plan it properly. No, we didn't plan it properly. And so we now have an opportunity to ensure that we plan this properly. But there is something, along with the capacity to budget, there is one issue. There is one issue that you will all agree with. We should in this place. You pick up a fishing magazine anywhere, you talk to a coastal community anywhere, and you say, listen, what do you reckon about a marine protected area? Well, you better have your mouth guard on. You better have your mouth guard on. And I can tell you what this legislation will do. It will make it popular. It will make it popular. It will put the force of Australian support, which they want to do, in a tool for looking after their bioregions and their marine estate. Because that's what Australians want. Now, this is a piece of legislation that quite forensically and quite cleverly deals with those issues that have not only hadn't made it popular, but it hasn't made it work. It hasn't worked because there are so many unintended consequences. We have displaced fisheries. We've made claims that we're going to compensate, and yet we haven't budgeted for it. 10 years after people are being compensated, they're still arguing with government. We need a planning phase, and we need a forensic mechanism of ensuring that we plan these things so there's no unintended consequences and at the same time we can continue to offer what we should be most proud of, our incredible marine biosphere, the highest level of protection we have internationally. I commend the bill to the House.
Thank you.